torn, terrorized, and humiliated in every way. For 6 weeks, nearly 30,000 Chinese women suffered mass rape by the Japanese army. Many of them ended up being executed in complete cold-bloodedness. Even minors were not spared, with girls as young as 8 years old suffering the same fate. This atrocious event is remembered as the Nanking Massacre and is one of the darkest and most inhumane moments of the armed conflict between the Republic of China and the Empire of Japan. During it, terrible crimes were committed, of which almost none were ever tried. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the brutal Nanking Massacre and how it marked the history of the women of China with blood. The actions that culminated in this atrocious event began on July 7, 1937. On that day, after years and years of growing tension between the two countries, Japan launched a full-scale invasion against the rival territory, beginning the Second Sino-Japanese War. At that time, China was weakened by the internal struggle between the Communist Party and the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Republic. Because of this, they were unable to confront the enemy advance. Quickly, the Japanese Empire managed to seize important cities and ports from the defenders, making the nation's offensive even more difficult. By November 1937, Japanese troops had taken Shanghai after a terrible and long battle. Both sides suffered incredible numbers of dead and wounded, but the Chinese were the ones who came out the worst. Chiang Kai-shek was forced to retreat to Nanking, the then capital of the country, and probably the next objective of the Imperials. Many of his officers, knowing that they had no chance of successfully defending the city, advised him to abandon it. But the Chinese leader could not simply hand over one of the nation's most important places to his enemies. He decided to guard it with soldiers who, due to the conflict, were not in the best condition. Nearly 80,000 men, including inexperienced conscripts and battered survivors of the Battle of Shanghai, were tasked with defending Nanking and the nearly 1 million civilians within it. Morale was at rock bottom. Still, the order had been given not to retreat under any circumstances. Anyone who disobeyed would be seen as a deserter and shot by his own superiors. A significant number of Europeans were living within the capital, either on business or as missionaries. Upon hearing news of the Japanese advance there, many fled, knowing the brutality of the attackers. But several of those who remained for this very reason decided to get involved in the matter. Thus, the Nanjing Safety Zone was established, where civilians could take refuge without fear of being persecuted by the Japanese, at least in theory. The Imperial Army had supposedly assured that it would not attack regions without Chinese soldiers, so this place, demilitarized, should not be in danger. Curiously, its administrator was a German member of the Nazi Party called John Rabe. He was chosen because his country was the one that had the friendliest relations with the invaders. Despite the National Socialist ideology of seeing any race as inferior to the Aryan, the time he spent living among the Chinese population led him to try to defend those he could.
The man who had the most chance to be helpful in this situation was Johann Rabe. Because he was German, no doubt it was largely a strategic decision. But other than Rabe, who could possibly have played that role?
The mayor of the capital ordered the citizens to move to the area, but either because they could not or because they thought nothing would happen to them, most did not. A large number escaped from Nanking, but hundreds of thousands of people remained as the Japanese approached. On the road between the two cities, the imperial troops had already begun their atrocities, and all the defenders had heard about them. On the nearly 300 kilometers that separated Shanghai from Nanking, Japanese soldiers showed a preview of what the occupation of the capital would be like. The road was transformed into a zone of death and destruction. The invading Air Force frequently machine-gunned the terrified Chinese villagers and refugees for no reason, just for fun. Many villages were burned down along with their inhabitants, and anyone able to escape was shot or bayoneted. Women were often raped, even those who were pregnant. It is said that they even cut open their bellies and removed their fetuses, while the victims bled helplessly on the ground. On December 9th, the demoralized defenders could see the endless rows of Japanese soldiers outside the walls of Nanking. The attackers offered terms of surrender, but the Chinese leaders, although outnumbered and outmanned, could not accept. The next day, under the orders of General Iwane Matsui, the Japanese attack began. It did not take long for the invading divisions to penetrate the poor local defenses and outmatch them in combat. The ill-equipped and ill-trained Chinese forces could do little against the advancing enemy. Some panicked soldiers tried to flee, only to be shot by their own officers. Within 3 days, most of Nanking was in Japanese hands. Realizing the hopelessness of the situation, Chiang Kai-shek allowed his forces to withdraw, but surrounded by the enemy, only a few managed to escape. Most of the 80,000 defenders died in those 3 days. Others abandoned their military uniforms and blended in with the civilian population, thinking that this would keep them safe. After this, the victors began their mopping up operations. The remaining pockets of resistance were eliminated, and weapons or military equipment were sought among the citizens. This also occurred within the safety zone, as it was claimed that Chinese soldiers were hiding there. Around 4,000 men accused of being deserting combatants were executed. Undoubtedly, many of them were only civilians. Despite the tens of thousands of deaths that had already occurred, the anguish of the population was only just beginning. The war between the two countries had dragged on longer than expected, and the Japanese High Command was looking for a way to force China to surrender. So it was decided to make its capital an example of what would happen to the rest of the population if resistance continued. From Tokyo, the soldiers were given permission to be as brutal as they wanted. Such behavior was even encouraged in order to intimidate Chiang Kai-shek and his followers. The city was soon devastated. Houses and businesses were looted and then burned. 1/3 of Nanjing was destroyed by fire. Any local walking in the streets could be subject to summary execution for no reason other than cruelty. Despite John Rabe's complaints to the Japanese embassy, nothing was done to control the unruly soldiers.
这么长的枪，这么长的刺刀，这个刺刀不要紧是枪，对我的爸爸这么伤，我的舅舅、我的爷爷都是被他杀死掉的。我的小弟弟是就拆死，日本人穿了个大皮鞋，把我小弟弟活活的拆死了，2岁多，肩上杀光了，妈杀到30多万，底下赔的40哦。
Two Japanese officers went so far as to engage in a macabre competition. The first of them to be able to decapitate 100 people with their swords before completing the conquest of the city would be the winner. When they reached that number and could not agree on who had been the fastest, they raised the goal to 150. This is not an uncommon fact, as even Japanese newspapers tracked their progress, celebrating their actions as heroic deeds. For much of the imperial population, the Chinese could barely be considered human beings. The Japanese, throughout the war with their neighbor, had barbarically mistreated captured enemy combatants. In Nanking, there was no exception. On December 17th, thousands of prisoners of war were tied by the hands and taken to the banks of the Yangtze River. For an hour, the attackers opened fire on them, slowly shooting them. The men could do nothing but watch as the people next to them were shot down, waiting for their turn. After the massacre, they were all stabbed with bayonets, in case anyone was still breathing. When it was certain that they had all been killed, their bodies were thrown into the river. This was one of the most famous massacres to take place in the city, but it was far from the only one. However, there were numerous occasions where similar acts took place. The Chinese population was arrested, accused of being undercover soldiers or saboteurs. In general, they were shot at, or explosives, such as mines, were thrown where they had been grouped. But kerosene was also used, burning them alive. As mentioned before, any survivors were finished off. The bodies were buried in mass graves dug by the victims themselves, or they were set on fire. When General Matsui heard of the level of atrocities his soldiers were reaching, he himself was shocked. Still, he did not order his men to stop. He reportedly told one of his aides, "I personally feel very sorry for the tragedies on the people, but the army must continue unless China repents." But beyond the tens of thousands of murders, a huge number of women were raped by Japanese soldiers in the weeks following the capture of Nanking. Whether they were adults, elderly women, or children, all were at risk. The invaders would break into homes and abduct the victims, or abuse them right there in front of their families. In many cases, they were killed after the act, often by mutilation with bayonets. Under official Imperial Army regulations, rape was forbidden. For soldiers, this simply meant that they were not to leave witnesses.
我妈妈就睡在桌子外的地上一起把的，我的小妹妹就死在院子里，我舅舅呢有地上都没有，就不晓得给他盖，不知道就这样的。后来我们出来摇这个也不扶，摇那个也不扶，没得一个扶人了。
Rape was an integral part of Japan's military culture. Many soldiers even believed in the superstition that sexually abusing women, especially virgins, would make them more powerful in battle. Because of this, many of them would go after underage girls, unfazed by the vileness of their actions. It is estimated that in the darkest moments of the conquest of the city, around 1,000 women were raped every day. Even those in the safety zone were not completely safe. While the area's administrators were sometimes able to convince soldiers who entered there to leave without getting what they were looking for, there are known cases where they were unable to prevent the crimes. The Japanese unleashed the most inhuman facets of their personality against these people. There are witnesses who speak of soldiers forcing Chinese at gunpoint to sexually abuse other inhabitants, including members of their own family. In this respect, the monks of Nanking were frequent victims of the attackers, who amused themselves by making them break their pact of chastity. It is believed that, in the 6 weeks that the capital was taken, between 20,000 and 30,000 women were raped by the invaders. As mentioned above, most of them were also killed, often together with their entire families, so that no one could speak of what had happened. In early 1938, Japan established the fourth of its puppet states in conquered territory, which it called the Reformed Government of the Republic of China. Nanking was placed under its administration. Under the pretext that the imperial troops had been able to restore order, they forced all citizens, even in the safety zone, to return to their homes. To control the masses now in their care, a huge quantity of drugs was distributed among them. These included drugs such as opium and heroin, and it is believed that up to 50,000 people became addicted to them. While some murders and abuses still occurred, they were far less numerous than in the weeks before. Now, under Japanese control, the city slowly began to function again. But nothing would be the same for the survivors. Much of Nanking had been destroyed by fire and artillery. Unburied bodies still littered the streets and had to be buried by locals to prevent the spread of disease. What had been the capital of one of the most populous countries in the world now resembled a ghost town. Beyond the citizens who had been evacuated, the number of people who lost their lives due to the actions of the Japanese was blood-curdling. In just 6 weeks, between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese, the vast majority civilians, were killed by the brutal enemy soldiers. It must be said that thanks to the actions of the administrators of the safe zone, almost the same number of people were saved from this fatal fate. John Rabe and his associates bravely defended the refugees, sometimes going so far as to physically place themselves between the soldiers and the civilians. Another of these foreigners was Minnie Vautrin, an American Christian missionary who served as the director of a university within the zone. During the Nanking massacre, Vautrin allowed more than 10,000 women to hide on the grounds of the establishment, saving them from abuse by the Japanese.
这里就是原来的金陵女子大学的大门，原来是篱笆墙，日本士兵啊经常通过这里翻墙头进去。遇到这种事情的时候呢，华小姐就站在门口，阻拦日本兵，并且给他们说理，驱赶他们。
As brutal as the numbers may seem, the conflict between the Chinese and Japanese had only just begun. It ended only in September 1945, along with World War II, more than 8 years after the first hostilities. During all this time, the atrocities committed by the Japanese continued, although none came close to the level of cruelty that occurred in Nanking. By the time the empire signed the capitulation, around 20 million people, most of them Chinese civilians, had lost their lives. After the fighting ended, trials were held against the losers. Matsui was identified as the person most responsible for the massacre and was sentenced to death. The 2 officers who carried out the bloody beheading contest also suffered the same fate. Still, the vast majority of the perpetrators were never tried for their actions in Nanking. While the evidence of the massacre is overwhelming, there are still many Japanese, both citizens and politicians, who deny that it ever happened, or who downplay the number of victims. Despite the Chinese population's calls for some kind of official apology, these pleas fall on deaf ears. Many of the deniers' arguments boil down to one simple phrase: it would be impossible to kill that many people in such a short time. Sadly, the events of December 1937 show that when it comes to cruelty, humans are capable of overcoming any kind of logic. We've reached the end of the video and we want to ask you, what do you think about the actions of foreigners in Nanjing? Don't forget to leave your answer in the comments box and subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.